Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our 8th episode. That's right, it's been more than 2 months now since we started doing the Julius Caesar themed streams and the reading of the Gallic War. Today, or tonight, I should say, we are finally starting the penultimate chapter in Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War. Want to thank you everyone for joining me. The last episode was exceptionally popular, I saw on YouTube. So thank you everyone for watching. I do appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to me read Julius Caesar's accounts of the Gallic War, and also just to learn together and to learn more about the man that Caesar was and the difficulties that the Romans faced in Gaul. I think it's a spectacular time period to study. Probably my favorite of all time. If you're watching this on YouTube, we do this live on Twitch, twitch.tv/authorvalentine. So we do this on Wednesday nights. You can head over there if you'd like to hang out with us live while we do this. So I would like to thank everyone who comes in and joins live and says hello. I really appreciate it. And if you are on YouTube, of course you can remember to like the video and subscribe. Also helps me out quite a bit. Before we get started today, I want to talk a little bit about this chapter. So the 7th book, as it's called, is the longest of Caesar's writings by far. 52 BC and the Revolt of Vercingetorix was the deciding point of the campaigns in Gaul. And this campaign occurred primarily over 3 major events. And in order, those were the Siege of Avaricum, the Siege of Gergovia, and the very famous Siege of Alesia, which decided the entirety of the war. Now, because of the length and the detail of all of these things, we're going to be taking them one step at a time. So today we're going to be focusing on the introduction to the revolt in Gaul, as well as the campaign against Avaricum. And the historians in the chat well know that this, perhaps more than any other, proved to be one of the most grueling sieges of late antiquity, or the mid-antiquity, I should say, of the late Republic, are the words I was looking for. Just as a refresher before we got to this point, it's helpful to remember that Caesar has been in Gaul since 58 BC, and it is now 52. What started as a defensive war against the migrating Helvetii was followed up by another defensive campaign in the interest of the Gauls themselves, of all the Gauls, against the German king Ariovistus, who had crossed the Rhine and subjugated the peoples he had sworn to help. In 57, Caesar was forced to confront a coalition of a nation called the Belgae, which were a collection of tribes that inhabited the northern and northeastern third of Gaul, and they gathered together hundreds of thousands of fighting men, and upon learning of this, Caesar marched to meet them. He did not wait for them to come, he marched to meet them instead, and it is there that Caesar met perhaps his best, or I would say his best, some might say his second best, ally of the war in the tribe of the Remi, who have been supporting Caesar ever since. After that, there was some brief campaigns that other historians usually don't note, but there was a campaign against the maritime tribes, the Veneti, and their allies, and it was during this time that Caesar decided to try and prevent revolts from spreading, so he sent some of his legates in different directions, some to the south to prevent the Aquitani from sending reinforcements or joining the war, and then some to the northeast along the coast. Caesar then, of course, crossed the Rhine. He crossed into Britain. These things he did 2 times. There was 2 crossings of the Rhine, true crossings into Britannia. And he continued to fight against many foes, including a second German invasion, the Usipetes and the Tencteri, who were nearly completely wiped out after they had crushed a Belgic tribe called the Menapi and charged across the Rhine. All of this culminated in a revolt in 54 by a man named Ambiorix. And Ambiorix was the king, or a co-king, of the Eburones tribe, who was a small tribe, a subsidiary of the Nervi. It was either the Nervi or the Treveri. I think it was the Nervi. And Ambiorix deceived 15 cohorts and marched them into a valley where he ambushed them and slaughtered them to a man. When the legates tried to surrender and beg for the lives of their men, those legates who were given audience after they were allowed to speak were then surrounded and murdered. After this, Ambiorix marched to the camp of Quintus Cicero, the brother of the famous statesman Marcus Cicero. And Cicero, unlike Sabinus and Cotta, was not about to give any ear to these Gallic traitors, and he held out in a spectacular siege against impossible odds until a message got out to Caesar of what was happening, and Caesar rushed to the rescue in the middle of winter. The next year, so the previous book that we just read last week was the follow-up to that event, where Caesar spent most of his time trying to crush and capture Ambiorix and his tribe, the Eburones. He invited Germans over even to pillage the lands of the Eburones. However, in the end, Ambiorix escaped capture. And now we find ourselves in 52 BC. By the Roman calendar, the year is 702 AUC. The consul, because there is only one consul for the year, is Pompey. I should say only one consul this year. That is not a normal happening. And the title of this chapter in this book, Book 7, is called Vercingetorix and the Great Revolt. So with that preamble out of the way, let's get started. Caesar says, "Now Gaul was pacified. Caesar set out for Italy to hold assizes as arranged. There he learned of the murder of Publius Clodius. When he heard news of the Senate's decree that all men of an age to do military service must take the oath, he decided to hold a levy throughout his province. News of this was quickly brought to Transalpine Gaul. The Gauls exaggerated the reports and embellished them with rumors, as the occasion seemed to require. Caesar, they said, was being detained because of a revolt at Rome, and was unable to join his army because of the serious unrest. Those who had previously lamented their subjection to the rule of the Roman people now had an opportunity to begin planning a strategy of war more freely and with greater daring. The Gallic leaders called an assembly in a remote forest location. There they deplored the execution of Acco, and declared that the same fate could befall all of them. They bemoaned Gaul's collective lot, and offered all kinds of pledges and prizes in the search for people prepared to start a war and risk their own lives to set Gaul free. First of all, they said, a strategy for cutting Caesar off from his army was essential, before their secret negotiations were revealed. This would be simple, because the legions would not dare to leave winter quarters without their commander, and the commander would not be able to reach his legions without an armed escort. Finally, they agreed it was preferable to die in battle rather than fail to recover their former military reputation and the freedom which they had inherited from their ancestors. Following this debate, the Carnutes declared that there was no risk they would not undergo for the good of all, and they promised to take the overall lead in initiating hostilities. For the time being, the Gauls could not use hostages to provide guarantees between themselves, for fear their plan should leak out. So they sought to solemnize it with an oath and a pledge, putting their military standards together, a rite of the greatest sanctity. This was to ensure that they would not be deserted by the rest after the war had been started. The Carnutes were warmly congratulated. The oath was taken by all who were present. The timing of their action was decided, and the meeting broke up. When the day came and the signal was given, the Carnutes charged on Cenabum, led by two reckless characters called Cotuatus and Concanetidamus. Concanetidamus. They slaughtered the Roman citizens who had settled there for business purposes. Among them, one Gaius Fufius Sita, a respectable Roman knight who presided over the corn supply on Caesar's orders, and plundered their property. News of this spread rapidly to all the Gallic states, for wherever an event of particular note or significance takes place, the Gauls shout it abroad in the countryside and in the villages. Others then take up the cry and pass it on to their neighbors. So it happened on this occasion, for what had taken place at dawn in Cenabum was made known before the end of the first watch in the Arvernian territory, which is about 160 miles away. There an Arvernian called Vercingetorix acted in similar fashion. He was the son of Celtulus, and his father had won dominion over the whole of Gaul. For this reason, namely, trying to gain a kingdom, Celtulus had been put to death by the state. Vercingetorix was a young man whose abilities were second to none. He summoned his dependents and easily roused them. Once his plan became known, there was a general rush to arms. His uncle, Gobernitio, and the other leading men who opposed taking such a risk tried to restrain him and banish him from the town of Gergovia. Still he persisted, and held a levy of down-and-outs and desperadoes in the open countryside instead. After he had mustered this gang, every Arvernian whom Vercingetorix approached was won over to his own point of view. He urged them to take up arms in order to win liberty for all. Once he had assembled a large force, he exiled the opponents who so recently had themselves expelled him. Vercingetorix was now proclaimed king by his supporters. He sent out embassies in all directions, asking everyone to remain loyal, and soon formed alliances with the Senones, the Parisi, the Pictonus, the Cadurci, the Tironi, the Alurci, the Lemnovicus, the Andes, and all the other Gallic peoples along the coast. The supreme command was conferred on him with unanimous approval. After winning this position of command, he demanded hostages from all these peoples, and ordered them to send him a specified number of soldiers at once. He decreed that each state must produce a given number of weapons before a certain date, and paid particular attention to the cavalry. In his command he combined extreme conscientiousness with extreme severity. He used harsh punishments to bring waverers into line, For the more serious offenses, death was inflicted by burning and all kinds of torture, while for lesser faults, the offender's ears were cut off or one of his eyes gouged out. He was then sent home as an example to others, to strike fear into them by the severity of the punishment. By such penalties as these, Vercingetorix quickly gathered an army. He sent a Cadurcan called Lucterius, a man of great daring, to the Ruteni with part of his force. He himself headed for the Bituriges. On his arrival, the Bituriges sent envoys to the Aedui, who were their protectors, to request assistance, the better to resist the enemy force. On the advice of the legates Caesar had left with his army, the Aedui then sent a force of cavalry and infantry to the assistance of the Bituriges. These forces reached the Loire, or the river which separates the Bituriges from the Aedui, and lingered there for several days, not daring to cross. They then returned home, and told the Roman legates that they had turned back for fear of treachery on the part of the Bituriges. They had discovered, they said, that the Bituriges had planned to surround them on one side, and the Arverni on the other, if they crossed the river. As to whether they withdrew for this reason, which they gave to the legates, or from motives of treachery, it does not seem appropriate to make a definite pronouncement, since we do not know for certain. Immediately after the departure of the Aedui, the Bituriges joined forces with the Arverni. In Italy, Caesar received news of these events. Once he understood that affairs at Rome were now in a more favorable position, thanks to the resolution of Pompey, he set out for Transalpine Gaul. On his arrival, he was faced with a considerable problem. By what strategy was he to reach his army? For he realized that if he summoned the legions to the province, they would have to engage in battle while on the march, and in his absence. But if he made his way to the army, he perceived that he could not, with any degree of safety, entrust his life even to the Gauls who at the time seemed to be peaceable. Meanwhile, Lucterius the Cadurcan, who had been sent to the Ruteni, won that people over to the side of the Arverni. He moved on the Nitiobrigus and the Gabali, and received hostages from both. Once he had mustered a large force, he made his way into the province towards Narbo, to launch an assault. On receiving news of this, Caesar decided that setting out for Narbo must take priority over all his other plans. When he arrived there, he reassured the frightened inhabitants, and stationed troop outposts among the Ruteni who lived in the province, and also among the Volcae, Arecomici, and the Tolosates, and around Narbo. These were the areas closest to the enemy. He also ordered a detachment of his forces from the province, and the fresh reinforcements which he had brought from Italy, to assemble in Helvian territory, which adjoins that of the Arverni. Lucterius was checked and forced to retire because of these preparations, as he considered it risky to venture within the outposts. Caesar set out for Helvian territory. The Cevennes Mountains, which separate the Arverni from the Helvi, made the march difficult because of the very deep snow there in winter. Even so, with great exertion, the soldiers cleared away the snow to a depth of 6 feet, and opened a way up. Then Caesar made his way through into the territory of the Arverni. They were caught off guard and unawares, for they thought that the Cevennes protected them like a wall, and at that time of year the paths had never been passable before, not even for individual travelers. Caesar ordered his cavalry to range as widely as possible, striking as much fear as he could in the enemy. Rumors and reports of this quickly reached Vercingetorix. The Arverni all surrounded him in a panic, begging him to consider their plight, and not to let them be plundered by their foes. Especially now, the focus of hostilities had clearly shifted on to themselves. He was swayed by their entreaties, and transferred his camp from the Bituriges back to Arvernian territory. Even so, Caesar had remained in this area for 2 days, as he had anticipated that Vercingetorix's plans would turn out this way. He then departed from his army, on the pretext of assembling reinforcements and cavalry, and left the young Brutus in command of the forces, instructing him to let the cavalry range as widely as possible in all directions. He would do his best not to be absent for more than 3 days. After all this was arranged, to the surprise of his own men, he made his way with all possible speed to Vienna. There he picked up a fresh force of cavalry, which he had sent on there some time before, and without breaking the march, by day or night, made his way through Aeduan territory into that of the Lingones, where 2 of his legions were wintering. His purpose in moving with such speed was to forestall the possibility of a plot by the Aedui, perhaps even a plot against his life. After arriving, he sent word to the rest of the legions, and had them assembled in one place before the news of his presence could reach the Arverni. On learning of his arrival, Vercingetorix brought his army back to the territory of the Bituriges. From there he set out against Gorgobina, a town of the Boii, and began to attack it. Caesar had settled the Boii there after defeating them in the campaign against the Helvetii, and had put them under Aeduan jurisdiction. This move presented Caesar with a considerable tactical problem. If he detained the legions in a single place for the rest of the winter, then he feared that once a people subject to the Aedui had been defeated, the whole of Gaul would desert him, in view of the fact that he had no protection to offer his friends. On the other hand, he was afraid that if he took his men out of winter quarters too early, they would then have difficulties over supplies because of problems with transportation. Yet it seemed preferable to endure any hardship rather than to accept such indignity and lose the goodwill of his supporters. So he encouraged the Aedui to transport supplies, and sent messengers on ahead to the Boii to tell them that he was on his way, and urged them to remain loyal and resist the enemy's attack with courage. Leaving 2 of the legions in Aegidancum with the heavy baggage of the whole army, he set out for the territory of the Boii. He reached Velanodunum, a town of the Senones, on the following day. To ensure no enemy was left in the rear, and to facilitate the transport of supplies, he laid siege to the town, and within 2 days had surrounded it with siege works. On the 3rd day, envoys were sent from the town to ask for terms of surrender. He ordered them to collect up their weapons and bring out their horses, and produce 600 hostages. He left his legate Gaius Trebonius to complete these arrangements. He himself set out for Cenabum, a town of the Carnutus, so as to complete his march as quickly as possible. News of the siege of Velanodunum had only just reached the Carnutus, who were expecting it to be rather a long drawn-out affair, and were amassing a force to send to the defense of Cenabum. Within 2 days, Caesar arrived. He encamped in front of the town, but the lateness of the hour was against him, and he put off the assault until the following day. He commanded his soldiers to prepare what was needed for the attack, as he was afraid that the people would escape from the town by night. For Cenabum was situated beside the bridge over the river Loire. He ordered 2 legions to keep watch under arms. Just before midnight, the people of Cenabum moved quietly out of the town and began to cross the river. When this was reported to him by the patrols, Caesar set fire to the gates, sent in the 2 legions which he had ordered to stand ready, and took possession of the town. He captured all but a very few of the enemy, because the narrowness of the bridge and the streets cut off the escape of the main body of citizens. He plundered the town and burnt it, gave booty to the soldiers, and led his army over the Loire, and made his way to the land of the Bituriges. When Vercingetorix learned of Caesar's arrival, he raised the siege of Jorgabina and set out to meet him. Caesar had begun to siege Novia Dunum, a town of the Biturigus which lay on his route. Envoys came to him from the town to beg him to pardon them and spare their lives. So in order to bring matters to a conclusion with characteristic speed, he ordered them to collect their weapons, bring out their horses, and produce hostages. Some of these hostages had already been surrendered, and the remaining tasks were being sorted out, while centurions and a few soldiers had been sent into the town to hunt out the weapons and horses. At that moment, the enemy cavalry, which had gone on ahead of Vercingetorix's column, was spied in the distance. The moment the townspeople caught sight of it, they began to hope for relief. Raising a shout, they started to take up weapons, close the gates, and man the wall. The centurions inside the town realized from the way the Gauls were behaving that they were devising some new plan of action. So they drew their swords, seized the gates, and got all their men out safely. Caesar ordered his cavalry to be led out of camp and engaged the enemy in battle. When his own cavalrymen got into difficulties, he sent to their assistance about 400 German horsemen. From the beginning, he had arranged to keep these men with him. The Gauls could not withstand their attack. They were put to flight and withdrew to the main army, with heavy casualties. After their defeat, the townspeople were in a panic once more. They seized the men they believed to be responsible for inciting the citizens, led them off to Caesar, and surrendered themselves to him. Now that these events had been brought to a successful conclusion, Caesar set off for Avaricum. This was a very large, particularly fertile area of territory. Once this town was won, he was sure that the nation of the Biturigus would give itself up to his control. Vercingetorix had suffered one setback after another, at Velinodunum, at Cenabum, at Novia Dunum. He summoned his supporters to an assembly and told them of the need to continue the war according to a totally different strategy from the one they had adopted until now. They must now concentrate their efforts on cutting the Romans off from food and supplies by every means possible. This would be easy, Vercingetorix claimed, because they themselves had a large force of cavalry, and also because the time of year was in their favor. The Romans could not cut forage for themselves, and would inevitably have to separate and go in search of food from buildings, and every day the Gallic cavalry could pick them off. Moreover, he went on, private interests must be sacrificed to the safety of all. They must burn down their buildings and settlements, which seemed likely to be within reach of the foraging parties on either side of their route. They would themselves have sufficient store of the necessary supplies, because they would receive material support from the Gallic peoples in whose territories the war was going on. The Romans, on the other hand, would either be unable to endure such hardship, or, at great risk, would advance considerable distances from their camp. It was of small importance whether they killed the Romans or merely seized the baggage without which they could not continue the fight. In addition, he said, they must burn any towns which were not protected from all danger by their fortifications and position. Thus there would be no refuge for Gauls to avoid taking part in the campaign, and also no chances for the Romans to carry off plenty of supplies and booty. If these proposals seemed harsh and severe, he concluded, they must remember that it was far worse to have their children and wives dragged off into slavery, and themselves be killed, and this was sure to be their fate if they were defeated. Vercingetorix's proposal received unanimous support. In a single day, more than 20 cities of the Biturigus were set on fire. The same policy was carried out in the other states. Fires were visible in every direction. The Gauls were all deeply distressed at this action, but even so, they put forward as their consolation the certainty that now victory was virtually assured. They would quickly recover all they had previously lost. At a general assembly, they debated whether Avaricum should be burned or defended. The Biturigus fell at the feet of all the Gauls, pleading not to be compelled to burn down with their own hands what was nearly the finest city in the whole of Gaul. A city, moreover, which both protected and adorned their nation. They claimed that its site made it easy for them to defend, for it was almost completely surrounded by a river and marsh. There was only one entranceway, and an extremely narrow one at that. Their plea was granted. Vercingetorix opposed it at first, but later he gave in to the appeals of his own men, out of pity for the people. Suitable defenders for the town were then selected. Oof. Let's take a quick sidebar, because that was a lot of information that just was dumped in there, and we've only just now gotten to Avaricum. So we had quite a bit of happenings before Avaricum even started. Something like 10 pages worth of events. So how did this start? Let me transfer over so you guys can see my face. I got a green screen, as you guys can see, so we're all fancy here. It's a little fuzzy on the sides, but then it picks up my mic in a little fuzzy way too, but that's okay. We're sitting in the Senate House now, so welcome to the Senate, gentlemen. So what happened here? How did this start? How did this whole event start? Well, there was, as Caesar said, a great meeting, a secret meeting of several Gallic tribes. And this was actually not led by Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix was not yet involved. This was led by the tribe called the Carnutes. And the Carnutes got together a lot of different peoples from a lot of different tribes, and they decided to revolt. And so they decided to attack a city called Cenabum in the territory of the Biturigus. And Cenabum was selected because there was a lot of Roman civilians living there, a lot of immigrants who had come, business people, traders, things like this. And Cenabum was essentially massacred. All the Romans were killed. And the war, the conflict, was afoot once more. Vercingetorix, interestingly enough, was, when he was trying to agitate for joining this campaign, was denied by his uncle of all people, who was at the head of the Arverni. He said, no. I know you want to fight, but we're going to stay out of this. We've been at, there's been various stages of war in Gaul for years. We're going to stay out. And Vercingetorix himself was actually exiled. And Caesar says he gets together a bunch of desperados and criminals and kind of gathers a gang almost. And then he uses this gang to go around and convince the other tribes to join him. And eventually he himself returns to Gergovia. So that's where he got kicked out from. And he gets let back in, and there the Arverni officially join the war, and overall command is given to Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix, of course, is quite brutal. He uses a lot of threats to get the other nations in line when necessary. Caesar mentions that, if there's crimes committed or people are wavering, he threatens and even uses the Wicker Man. He'll burn people alive. He'll take their eyes out. He'll cut off their ears. And those people that he mutilates, he'll send them back to their homes as a warning to their tribesmen of what happens. So, by methods such as these, Vercingetorix gets everybody in line. And this is how he gathers some great support. Now, Vercingetorix's strategy, or rather the strategy of the Gauls, was to prevent Caesar from joining with his army. That doesn't work out. There's a lot of back and forth. The Gauls head for the territory of the Boii, and if you guys remember, Caesar mentions it here actually. The Boii were a tribe that Caesar settled in with the Aedui, and the Aedui agreed to take him in and give him full rights and things like that. Caesar moves up to the territory of the Biturigus. Vercingetorix, he first moves into the territory of the Arverni from the south. Then he swings around and hits the Biturigus, and he's ping-ponging Vercingetorix's army back and forth pretty well. And now they're coming towards Avaricum. And Avaricum was an interesting situation. Because Avaricum, as Caesar said, was basically the crown jewel of a city of the Biturigus. And even though Vercingetorix ordered a scorched earth policy, the Biturigus themselves came to him and were like, please, this city is impenetrable. It's surrounded by rivers and marshlands. There's only one way in and one way out. There's no way he's going to get us here. And Vercingetorix initially says, no, you got to burn it down. We're going scorched earth. You gotta get it out of here. But eventually their pleas get to him, and he says, okay, fine. If you can make a stand there, let's do it. And so that's where we are. That's how the siege of Avaricum is coming about. So let's go ahead and keep reading a bit and see what happens next at Avaricum. Vercingetorix followed Caesar by short marches, and chose a place for his camp which was protected by marshes and woods, about 15 miles from Avaricum. Their reliable scouts kept him hourly informed of what was going on at Avaricum, and he issued orders for what he wanted done. He kept watch on all our foraging parties and corn-gathering expeditions. When our men were obliged to scatter and range farther afield, he attacked them and inflicted serious harm. Our men countered this as far as they were able by means of forward planning, going out in different directions, and not at fixed times. Caesar pitched his camp on the side of the town, which, as we mentioned above, had a narrow entrance left open by the river and the marshes. There he began to prepare an earthwork, move up siege shelters, and construct 2 towers, for the geography of the site made it impossible for him to encircle it with siege works. He continued to press the Boii and Aedui about the supply of corn. The Aedui were little help, for they carried out his request without enthusiasm. The Boii had few resources, for their state was poor and ineffectual, and they soon consumed whatever they did have. So the army suffered extreme difficulties over the corn supply because of the ineffectiveness of the Boii and the negligence of the Aedui, and because of the burning of buildings to such an extent that for several days the soldiers went without corn altogether, and warded off the worst of their hunger by driving cattle in from faraway villages. Even so, not one of them was heard to utter a word which would disgrace the sovereignty of the Roman people and its previous victories. Indeed, when Caesar spoke to each of the legions while they were busy with the works, and said that he would put an end to the siege if they were finding the scarcity of food too hard to endure, every one of them begged him not to do so. For a number of years, they said, they had served under his command without incurring any dishonor, or abandoning any action once they had undertaken it. They would consider it disgraceful now to leave the siege they had begun. They would rather endure every hardship than fail to avenge the Roman citizens who had perished at Cenabum because of Gallic treachery. This was the decision they entrusted to the centurions and military tribunes, so that they could report it to Caesar. The towers were already coming close to the wall when Caesar learned from prisoners that Vercingetorix had run out of food supplies and moved his camp nearer to Avaricum. Also that Vercingetorix himself intended to take his cavalry and the light-armed troops, which usually fought among them, and set a trap, and that he had set out for the next place where he expected our men to go the next day in search of forage. After receiving this news, Caesar silently set out at midnight, and in the morning reached the enemy camp. The Gauls had soon learned from scouts of Caesar's coming. They hid their wagons and heavy baggage in the depths of the woods, and drew up their entire force in a high open place. When news of this came, Caesar gave orders for the men to pile up their packs and get their weapons ready. The Gauls were established on this hill, which sloped gently upward from its base, and was almost immediately surrounded by a marsh, no more than 50 feet wide, but virtually impenetrable. After breaking up their causeways, therefore, they had complete confidence in the security of their position. Separated into divisions according to their nationalities, they had control of all the fords and passes over the marsh. If the Romans tried to break across the marsh, the Gauls were determined to attack them from their advantageous position while they were stuck fast. As a result, any observer looking at how close the Gauls were would think that they were ready to fight under almost equal battle conditions. But anyone who perceived that the relative positions of the two armies was unequal would realize that the Gauls were only making an empty pretense of readiness to engage. The Roman soldiers were furious that the enemy was able to endure the sight of them and stand firm, especially at so short a distance, and they clamored for the signal to engage. But Caesar explained that victory would inevitably cost them dear in terms of losses and the deaths of many brave men. Moreover, when he saw that they were so ready to take any risk to win him honor, he would himself deserve utter condemnation if he did not treat their lives as more valuable than his own safety. That same day, after comforting the soldiers in this manner, he led them back to camp and organized everything else necessary for the siege of Avaricum. On returning to his supporters, Vercingetorix was accused of treachery, for shifting his camp nearer to the Romans, for setting off with the entire cavalry, leaving a large force without its commander, and because after his departure the Romans had seized their opportunity and arrived so soon. It was impossible, said his accusers, for all this to have taken place by chance and not by deliberate design. He preferred to become king of Gaul with Caesar's permission, rather than through their support. This was the substance of the charges against him, but Vercingetorix replied to the charges by pointing out that as far as moving camp was concerned, he had taken this step because of the shortage of food, and had even done so with their approval. As for coming too close to the Romans, he had been influenced in his decision by the advantage offered by the site in question, for the protection it provided meant that it practically defended itself. Furthermore, there could have been no need of the cavalry services in marshland, whereas they had proved useful in the place where they had been sent. It was by deliberate policy that he had not entrusted the supreme command to another man on his departure, to prevent popular pressure forcing anyone into fighting. And he could see that they were all lacking in resolution and wanted to engage only because they could no longer bear this degree of hardship. If it was by chance that the Romans had arrived on the scene, he went on, then they had fortune to thank, while if the Romans had been summoned because someone had leaked information to them, they ought themselves to thank the traitor for enabling them from their advantageous position to find out how few the Romans were, and to despise them as cowards for not daring to engage and instead withdrawing back to their camp. He had no desire to win a position of command from Caesar through some act of treachery. Such a position was within his grasp in any case, thanks to the victory of which he and Gaul were already assured. Yes, and he would even give them back his command if they believed they were conferring a distinction upon him greater than the security which they received from him in return. So that you understand, I am speaking the whole truth concerning these matters, said Vercingetorix. Listen to these Roman soldiers here. He brought forward some slaves captured while foraging a few days previously. They had been tortured, imprisoned, and starved. They had already been drilled in what to say when they were interrogated, and declared that they were legionary soldiers who had been driven by hunger and lack of provisions to escape the camp in secret and search for whatever corn or cattle they could find in the countryside. The whole army, they claimed, was in a similar want, and no one had the strength enough to endure any strenuous effort. So their commander had decided that if his army had made no progress with the siege within 3 days, he would withdraw it. "These are the services I have rendered you," said Vercingetorix. "Though you accuse me of betraying you, even though your own blood has not been shed, you see before you a mighty and victorious army reduced to starvation. And I have ensured that no Gallic state will receive the Roman army within its borders when it seeks refuge in ignominious flight." The whole host shouted aloud and clashed their weapons together, as is their custom when indicating agreement with someone's proposal. They declared Vercingetorix the finest of leaders. There could be no doubt of his fidelity, and no better strategy for the campaign. They resolved to send to the town 10,000 picked men from the whole force, and decided that the safety of all was not to be entrusted to the Biturigus alone. This was because they were aware that the Biturigus would win all the credit for victory if they held the town. The Gauls used every kind of ingenuity to counter the extraordinary bravery of our soldiers. They are an extremely resourceful people, and particularly talented at copying and putting into practice anything they are taught. Now, for example, they began using nooses to turn our grappling hooks aside. Once these were made secure, they used ropes to drag them inside the walls. They also started tunneling beneath our earthwork to undermine it. This was all the more skillfully done because they have many iron mines, and so are practiced experts in every kind of tunneling. They had covered every section of their wall with towers, and overlaid these with hides. Now they made frequent sorties by day and night, trying to set fire to the earthwork or attack our soldiers while they were working on the siege. They tried to match the height of our towers, which increased daily as the earthwork was raised higher and higher, by extending the scaffolding on their own towers. They sabotaged the progress of the mines, which we had driven by the use of timbers tempered and sharpened at the end, boiling pitch, and heavy rocks. In this way they prevented us from coming close to the walls of the town. All Gallic walls follow virtually the same pattern. At right angles to the wall, along its entire length, beams are placed in the ground at equal intervals, 2 feet apart. These are secured firmly from the inside, and then covered with large amounts of rubble. The gaps we mentioned between them are filled with large rocks at the front. Once the beams are laid and joined, another level is added on top. The length of the gaps remains the same, but the second set of beams does not touch the first. Rather, because the spaces in between the beams are the same, each one is firmly kept separate by single stones. The whole construction is built in the whole construction is built in this manner until the wall reaches the appropriate height. The finished edifice is not unattractive, with the variations in its appearance and the alternating beams and rocks in straight lines following the line of their own level. Moreover, it offers an excellent means for practical defense of cities. The stones give protection from fire, and the timber from battering rams, for it is impossible to break through continuous beams, usually 40 feet long, and secured on the inside, or to tear them apart. All these factors hindered the siege operation. Despite continually being obstructed by the cold and constant rain, by unremitting effort, our soldiers still overcame every obstacle. Within 25 days, they had built an earthwork 330 feet wide and 80 feet high, which almost touched the enemy wall. As was his custom, Caesar stayed by the works, on the alert, and urged the soldiers not to cease their efforts for so much as a moment. Shortly before the third watch, smoke was observed coming from the earthwork, for the enemy had tunneled underneath, and set fire to it from below. At that moment, a shout went up all along the wall, and the enemy made a sortie from the 2 gates beside our towers. At long range, some of the enemy began to throw torches and tinder from the walls onto the earthwork. They poured down pitch and other inflammable material, so that it was almost impossible to make a calculated decision about which point the men should head to first, or where they should bring help. Even so, it was Caesar's regular practice to keep 2 legions on watch in front of the camp, and there were more available because they were working on the earthwork in shifts. So it was soon settled that some of our men countered the sorties, while others withdrew the towers and broke up a section of the earthwork. A whole crowd rushed out of the camp and put out the fire. The night was now at an end, yet fighting continued everywhere, and the enemy's hopes of victory were continually being renewed, especially since they could see the wooden screens on our towers being burned down, and observe how difficult it was for our men to move forward in support, while thus exposed. On their side, a constant supply of fresh troops replaced those who were exhausted. They believed that at that very moment the salvation of Gaul hung in the balance, and there then occurred, before our very eyes, something which seemed to us worth recording, which we believed should not be passed over. A Gaul stood before the town gate, opposite our tower, and was throwing lumps of tallow and pitch, which were passed from hand to hand into the fire. He was wounded in the right side by a dart from an artillery machine, breathed his last, and fell. One of the Gauls nearby stepped across the man as he lay there and carried on with the same task. When he was killed in a similar manner by a dart, a 3rd man took over, and likewise a 4th succeeded him. Nor was that position abandoned by their defenders before the fire on the earthwork was put out. The enemy was driven off on every side, and the fighting at an end. The Gauls had tried everything, and everything had failed. The next day they took the decision to flee from Avaricum, at Vercingetorix's prompting and instruction. They hoped that by making the attempt in the silence of the night, they would bring it off without serious casualties on their own side, especially because Vercingetorix's camp was not far from the town, while a long stretch of marsh in between would hinder the Romans' pursuit. They were making ready for this nocturnal escape, when suddenly the married women rushed out and threw themselves weeping at the feet of their men. They begged and pleaded with the men not to abandon them and their children to the enemy's torments, just because their natural physical weakness made it impossible for them to join the flight. When they realized that the men were sticking to their plan, for in general, at times of extreme danger, panic allows no place for pity, these women began to cry out and alert the Romans to their flight. The Gauls were so stricken with fear of the Roman cavalry overtaking them on the road that they abandoned their plan. The following day, one of the towers was brought forward, and the siege works which Caesar had set up were put in order. A fierce rainstorm blew up, and he thought that this would be a good moment to put his plan into action, for he could see that the sentries stationed on the wall were somewhat carelessly posted. So he ordered his men to be more negligent about carrying out their duties, and explained what he wanted done. The legions concealed behind shelters were outside the camp and ready for action. Caesar urged them all, at long last, to reap the fruits of victory in return for their great efforts. Promised rewards to the first men over the wall, and gave his soldiers the signal. They rushed out from every side and quickly occupied the wall. This unexpected action panicked the enemy. They were forced down from their wall and towers, and made a stand in close formation in the marketplace and open spaces, intending to form a battle line and fight to the death if they met obstruction from any quarter. When they saw that no one was coming down to level ground, but that men were pouring all around the wall, they were so afraid of losing their chance to escape altogether. So they threw their weapons away, and with a concerted effort made for the furthest reaches of the town. There some of them found themselves crushed in the narrow openings of the gates, and were killed by our soldiers. Others got through the gates and were killed by the cavalry. Not one of our men gave a thought to booty. They were so severely provoked by the massacre at Cenabum, and the effort they had put into the siege, that they spared neither the elderly, nor the women, nor even the little children. In the end, a total number of 40,000, of a total number of about 40,000, barely 800 reached Vercingetorix safely. These had run from the town as soon as they had heard the shout. Vercingetorix was afraid that their arrival might evoke the pity of the ordinary Gauls and so lead to a riot in the camp. In silence, therefore, and at dead of night, he intercepted their flight. He posted his close friends and the leaders of the peoples at a distance down the road, and took measures to have the survivors split up and taken to their own peoples, and the parts of the camp allotted to each from the start. The next day he summoned an assembly, spoke words of comfort, and urged them not to be too downhearted or anxious over this setback. After all, he said, the Romans had not won because of their bravery or an open battle, but rather by means of trickery and siegecraft, in which they themselves were inexperienced. Anyone who expected all outcomes in time of war to be favorable was mistaken. He himself had never wanted a defense of Avaricum, and they were witnesses to the fact. This setback they had just received had come about because of the folly of the Bitterigus, which everyone had indulged too far. Even so, he continued, he would swiftly repair the damage with some more significant advances. By strenuous efforts on his part, he would bring in the peoples who were presently at odds with the rest of Gaul and establish a single strategy for the whole of Gaul. Such a unity of purpose, even the entire world could not withstand, and already he had all but achieved it. Meanwhile, it was only right that he should ask them, for everyone's safety, to fortify the camp so that they could more easily withstand a sudden enemy attack. This speech found favor with the Gauls, above all because the setback he had suffered had not made Vercingetorix downhearted, or caused him to go into hiding and keep out of everyone's sight. In addition, they thought he showed foresight and perspicacity since he had advised first the burning, then the abandonment of Avaricum, even before anything had gone wrong. The result was that, although defeat diminishes the authority of other commanders, the prestige of Vercingetorix by contracts grew daily because of the setback he had suffered. At the same time, they began to be hopeful because of his assurance about making an alliance with the remaining peoples. Then, for the first time, the Gauls began to fortify their camp. Though unaccustomed to hard work, they were yet so alarmed as to believe that they had to put up with whatever he ordered them to do. And so, the siege of Avaricum comes to a devastating end. So what happened here? Well, the Romans were starving. And the Gauls, these are not the same Gauls as they are used to fighting. Remember, a lot of these Gauls have spent a long time, several of them perhaps even fighting alongside the Romans. They were forced to act as auxiliaries to the Roman legions. And so many have learned their way of fighting. Caesar mentions that in particular the Bitterigus have a lot of iron mines, and so they're very experienced with tunneling. And so they're learning and adapting to Roman warfare. And while in the past, Caesar would have had a lot of kind of swift victories over these people. Now he's finding it much more difficult to achieve what used to be so easy for him. Now it's taking a lot more effort. It was a terrible battle, a terrible siege. The Romans were starving. It's not like they were running on reserves. They had run out of food completely. And Caesar mentions that they were incensed by the slaughter at Cenabum, and in their starvation and their rage, they gave no care, no mind. They paid no mind to wealth or treasures. They didn't even try to run into the houses and take booty. Instead, they hunted the Gauls down, every single one, and killed them. And this was the, there's a saying that some people I've heard before, where all men are just three good meals away from committing terrible acts, and you can kind of see it in this siege. When you're starving, when you're on your last legs, all the kind of pretense of civilization and traditional goodness gives way to the more base, bestial survival instincts. And that part of your brain turns into that mode where it just says, live or die. No one's thinking about how historians are going to talk about this later. No one's thinking about getting rich. They're thinking about winning, about avenging their fallen comrades, about getting food, and about surviving. That's what it's about, and it's wild. And Caesar doesn't sugarcoat it. He's like, no, this is exactly what happened. There was 40,000 people in that city, and less than 1,000 got out alive. Many of them were crushed against the walls, he says. That was the first encounter. That was our very first encounter of the Revolt of Vercingetorix. And it was a Roman victory, albeit a very close one. It could have gone a lot worse. Which means, for today, that's about as far as we're going to go. Next time, we're going to be moving on to the second confrontation of the Revolt of Vercingetorix, which is going to be the Siege of Gergovia. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because we just said it about 5 times. Gergovia is the capital of the Arverni. It's Vercingetorix's hometown. After that, the week after, we'll be going to Alesia, to the Siege of Alesia, a very famous siege. And after that, we only have one book left, and that's book 8. It's the Oft Forgotten. Everyone kind of thinks the Gallic War ends at Alesia, and for all intents and purposes, it kind of does. That's the deciding conflict. But there's plenty more that happens in the following year that we will, of course, be reading, and I can't wait to do it. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me today, or tonight, I should say. I'll be uploading this up to YouTube within the next couple days, so fear not if you're watching this on Twitch, or if you just got here late and want to see the whole thing, you will be able to do so. I'll let you guys know. If you are watching this on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. If you've gotten this far, congratulations. You can leave a like and subscribe. I greatly appreciate it. You can join us on Twitch, twitch.tv/authorvalentine, where we do a lot of Roman history and a mix of horse races in a game called Caesar 3 from 1998. Very good stuff. And until next time, thank you all so much. I will see you guys next Wednesday, where we will continue the Revolt of Vercingetorix. Have a good night.